Hello and welcome to this Meet the World event in association with the National Centre for Writing in Norwich. I'm Tiffany Atkinson. I'm a poet and a teacher based here in Norwich, and today I'm really delighted to be hosting a conversation with two brilliant contemporary poets, Guang and Sam Riviere, who are meeting today virtually for the first time, but whose work, as we will explore, has some really important affinities in its innovation, its thinking around the edges of contemporary poetic practice and process, and perhaps some significant differences too. We will explore this in due course. So I will introduce our two poets and then we'll see where the conversation takes us. Guang is a poet and editor based in Singapore. He's author of the International Left-Hand Calligraphy Association from Tin Fish Press in 2022 and Deeds of Light from Math Paper Press in 2015, which was shortlisted for the Singapore Literature Prize. He's been a visiting fellow at the University of Iowa and the Nanyang Technological University, and he's presently on an e-residency at the National Centre for Writing in Norwich. And he's joining us today from Singapore with thanks to the National Arts Council of Singapore for supporting the event. I think we might discuss some of the complexities of e-residency and what that means in due course, particularly as it pertains to e-trips around Norwich, since Sam and I are both sort of old-timers of the city in different ways. But right now I'm the only one who's physically presently in it. Sam Riviere is a UK-based poet and publisher and editor who has published 3 highly acclaimed collections from Faber and Faber: 81 Austerities in 2012, which won the Forward Prize for first collection, Kim Kardashian's Marriage in 2015, and After Fame most recently in 2020. And perhaps these are the triumvirate of books that we might be most closely focusing on today. He has also published experimental prose in Safe Mode of 2017 and a novel Dead Souls in 2021. Sam also runs the micro publisher If a Leaf Falls, which publishes very beautiful limited edition titles with an emphasis on appropriative and procedural writing processes. And as I mentioned before, Sam has his own historic connection to Norwich, having studied at the art school here and at the University of East Anglia. So very warm welcome and welcome back to both of you. Lovely to have you here in this e-space. And I'd really like to start by asking you to introduce yourselves by way of a short reading from your work. So Guang, would you start, please?
Sure. Thank you, Tiffany, and thanks, Sam, for coming down. I'm actually going to read from the International Left-Hand Calligraphy Association. I'm not sure, Tiffany, if you've heard these before, but some of these poems are actually sort of collaged from bots of New York. These are like Facebook bot posts. And other things as well. In our unsteady house, the windows shift constantly. That euphoria when a new fire comes through the door, lost at work, entangled in the linen. In our spontaneous house, the floors give way gently to visions of Monday coming out to my ear. Will they be like a movie? Not a movie, but a film? The International Left-Hand Calligraphy Association closes at noon, a beloved who disappoints. Countless petitions. Yesterday's orchids and burning violet coals are inexplicable and cheap, and I too have murmured as much. Surely children were harmed. Crimes fled like dreams on both sides. Seconds ago, you recall with vivid ache the painter coaxing tomorrow's orchids to life. My petitions seize the airwaves and brim over with tears. These, too, are garments. And I'll just read one more. As like hives of meaning, buzzing and not quite stable, I trip over on the way to Pilates, a crack in the patella of the earth. Continuously, I miss a spot and look in all these appointments just by not needing. I miss the daily ferry daily. My living room fills with search engine exhaust, and shame lives on a landfill of things I miss. Stand up, stand up. Wasted time, mister, takes more time to distill.
Thank you for the invitation, and so nice to hear the poems. The Left Hand Calligraphy Association. I'll read a few poems from a book called Conflicted Copy that I think will come out in the summer. This is a manuscript made using, maybe inevitably using AI, but not ChatGPT, but an earlier iteration, GPT-2, which is much sort of jankier and unpredictable, I found. They're pretty short, so I'll just read a sort of clutch of them. True PDF. A picture book filled entirely with text, a soft blue font, white ink and yellow borders, a simple grid, a few lines on each page, a gentle voice singing as it speaks. True mode. Now you're done with the usual paper and ink, unless this sounds like a bad idea. You're free to wander out of the study room into the open air and see what's waiting for you. A view of some distant city with its towers looming on the horizon, some more mountains to your right, a vast river flowing below you in the same way you just read about in your notebook. Pink poem. A big chunk came from these two poems. One, the blue ball poem. Two, the pink balloon poem. Both I found online. One took about 25 seconds to memorize, while the other was probably a lot more difficult. In any event, both of their sections were quite interesting and gave an impression you had to repeat in order to understand. To illustrate, they have been rendered in colour and enlarged slightly. After PDF generation, it is loaded onto my MacBook Pro. As expected, there seems no real point in doing this, and only a few words from either side would make an impression in a video of any kind. That leaves the audio of your speech as your last resort. You know this is coming from experience. When my laptop froze a moment after the video ended, and all I was able to hear was random buzzing on speaker, I decided to listen. And I'll read this as the last one I'll read. Safe poem. It would not have mattered if his parents could have seen the face he lived with every morning, how it was shaped and stretched like an ode to the future. He would still have smiled through it, like in the picture. All was clear. The image hung there as long as he breathed on it. For years now it had bloomed, becoming less static, more intricate with age, growing wider and fainter, changing to a colourless translucent shade that only made him smile more slowly, more lovingly, as if in pain from it.
Thank you both. That's a great introduction to both of your work, and clearly raising some themes that I hope we can discuss in some detail. I mean, obviously, the one about the sort of integration of technology for sort of post-internet subjectivity, I suppose, to say nothing of poetry, and how integrated that is in our everyday lives. I mean, right now we're recording this in home spaces, and I particularly enjoyed your penultimate poem you read there, Sam, because it spoke to the anxiety of sort of ambient technological failure, which I experienced just before we started this recording. So it's that the sense that there's a kind of wishfulness of the digital experience being seamless and easy, but actually fraught with all kinds of embarrassments and inadvertent kind of mess ups and things like that. And it's refreshing to see that brought into the poetic process. I wondered if how Guang, we just ask you to say a little bit about what you've been working on specifically for this residency, because it seems particularly to pick up on some of these themes.
Yeah. So I was sort of not very well behaved when I talked about the book, because that's not what I'm doing on this residency. And in fact, what I've been doing is trawling through these Singaporean and Malaysian internet forums. And these forums are birthed out of sort of like, these are originally tech forums. So you go there to find the best like laptop or the best phone. And they also have these spaces for just chit chat. And these chit chat spaces have developed their own sort of idiosyncratic idiom, their own versions of English or Singlish. Singlish might be familiar to some of you, but they have sort of mutated that language into a thing all of its own. And so I've been finding poetry from there, being very strict about it also. So I don't write any of my own words. I only take from it and sort of introduce line breaks, perhaps. Take different things from different posts and put them together. And that's what I've been doing all residency long. And I've been hopefully pleasantly baffling Tiffany with these poems every couple of weeks. And I should also add that I myself don't fully understand everything that I'm encountering or finding. But that sort of adds to it. I think very, very fascinating, sort of rich, inventive language that I think it's a pity it hasn't been recognized as poetry so far.
Yeah, I mean, in that case, it's so great that we've got Sam here, because I think, as far as I'm aware, 81 Austerities is one of the first sort of high-profile collections to work explicitly with harvested and manipulated text. I'm also struck there by how, Guang, when you talk about forums that have a now historic feel. I mean, they're not contemporary, are they? They already have a kind of timestamp. They have a slightly kind of, if we can dare say, antiquated feel. And I'm wondering, Sam, if I can ask you, because one of the conversations we've had quite frequently, how Guang and I, is about the harvesting and manipulation of material, for want of a better phrase, and how one goes about that. I wondered if you could draw on any of your three. I mean, you've got three very different collections, actually.
It's very interesting to hear about this process, and I really like the idea of like this sort of language that's been preserved somewhere in this sort of chamber of the internet, and it's all still there. I feel like the internet sort of become cleaned up in some ways, that it was certainly easier when I first started doing this sort of writing to access like weird and unpredictable and like slightly inscrutable stuff. And now I feel like it's gradually become a much more commercial space. But yeah, these sort of forums, there's something quite was sentimental about this idea of them hanging there in space like jellyfish or something, like in the sort of, I don't know, they're just strange life forms. And some of this is familiar to me, I suppose. My first book wasn't mostly found. There was definitely some found text in there, but it was largely just sort of speed written. And the second book, Kim Kardashian's Marriage, is entirely found text, and it's a very similar process by the sound of it. I used the titles of the poems are the search terms with which I found the content of each poem, but the content tended to be from multiple sites. So I think I had a rule which was something like I could take the first 10 results, and normally I didn't get off the hit page, I just used what was there. But sometimes if then seemed something particularly interesting, I would go a bit further. But I didn't need to go very far, actually, to find enough content for the poems. And I suppose it became like this process of aggregation, which I feel like it lends itself to the poetry book or the poetry collection, that you can undertake like how Guang was saying, like a trawling process. And it becomes like a trawling, filtering, assembling and feeding back in sort of process. It's like you're the digestive tract of something. And so I feel like I like this idea a lot. And for me, in terms of image making and music making, there's similar methods at work in post-internet, which just means that perhaps it's more obvious to everyone, but quite a lot of artistic process is a sort of filtering and feeding back process, it seems to me. And that maybe these procedures just make that a bit more obvious. But yeah, it sounds like the Kardashian book and this are pretty close in process, I would say. No original language and some sense of collage from reading the manuscript. This is the Eat, Drink, Man, Woman, yes?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. No, I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. I should add that Kim Kardashian's Marriage is one of the things that I read that sort of gave me the impetus, or perhaps inspired me to go in this sort of a direction as well.
No, thank you. I mean, for me as well, there were books or poetry stuff I found that had a similar effect. I mean, there was the Flav movement in the early 2000s, which was like sort of zany found text, which I just intuitively really liked this approach to writing. Yeah, so I feel like it's one of these, like with any sort of collage, that collage in itself is a kind of like inherited and sort of in a weird way de-individualized sort of practice. Like I think there's been collage as long as there's been paper or something. So it feels like it's connected to technology in some way as well. And I'm sure every printing development has resulted in new approaches to new opportunities for collage or something like that. So I feel like it's one of these sort of contagious art forms. Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right. Sort of to not sort of keep this idea that sort of technology means the internet, means something digital, and that printing isn't. I mean, printing, of course, has always been technology, and those combinatory forms have been around for a while. I'm struck, how Guang, by you saying earlier that you felt this was talking about sort of particularly chat room language and its particular idioms, which again sort of change over time and which can seem quite outdated quite quickly. You said yourself that you felt estranged by some of them, that you don't feel like you're necessarily at home in those linguistic environments, those jellyfish environments anymore. I wondered if you could say a bit about a bit more about that, and perhaps also linking that to the idea of what makes this poetry. You know, what does poetry, if you like, get, or the idea of a poem get out of this particular contribution? Perhaps both of you might have different answers to that.
Yeah. So I think the first thing that comes to mind is that these forums are also places where people form, at least, you know, the old version of these forums, like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, where they form these very intense, sort of interesting friendships. And they sometimes spill over into the real world. So they meet online first, and they have this thread where they're all into a certain thing together. And then they start saying things like, oh, we should meet in person. And then they actually meet, and they record their friendships on these forums. And the way that they speak has, becomes a way to code that they are in this, like, in-group. And it becomes a lot more hermetic, but also a lot more playful. So they're using language to sort of like have fun, and to express their friendship, I guess. So that to me is quite interesting, because like you might think, or we might think that internet language has a sort of depersonalizing effect. But in some of these cases, actually, it's very personal. It's very intimate. It's just that intimacy that we are not privy to, right? Or it's a weird form of intimacy where we can read it, but we don't really understand it, but we know that it means something to the people using it. So that's sort of the weird space that I found myself in looking through these forums. And as to why it's poetry, well, it's really playful, for one. Singapore and Malaysia have used multiple languages in real life, and they collide in sort of interesting, unexpected ways in the forums. So there's the decades-long thread that's dedicated to people who like to visit Thai discos, which are basically these like places where you go to like find a Thai girl to like give money to and perhaps bring home to bed. And these Singaporean men are basically picking up bits of Thai because they go to these discos a lot and like speaking in broken Thai or like typing in broken Thai. And there are other forums where people are using Malay and sort of like mixing Malay with English in ways that are very inventive. That I've recorded in poetry, but I find it very difficult to read out because I don't speak Malay as well as I should. So all these things that are happening, I think, make me very interested in looking at these ways of speaking or typing as poetry. Yeah, don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, that's what came to mind.
Yeah, there's something about not understanding that I feel like that's a strong motivation for me in exploring these things sometimes. Sometimes it feels like there's a sort of there's an assumption that like because you write using these sort of approaches that you're an expert or something. But I feel very much the opposite, that I'm totally a novice. And in fact, I probably find some of this uncanny because it's so unfamiliar to me. Whereas someone who is more au fait with technology would probably know why that is the case or something. But I feel like I'm struck in quite a naive way sometimes by like the contrast between certain language or the innovation that's happening in the language, where this just might be a fairly familiar acronym if you're from that community or something. So there's that, like, I feel like having a glimpse into this world where there's these codes that are up and running and seem to have been going a long time. And that's not dissimilar to poetic language in a lot of ways. It has its own traditions. It has its own, like you said, idioms, and its own in-jokes, actually. And I feel like a lot of modern poetry is in-jokes. A lot of it is, you could frame it that way. Like a lot of the avant-garde, particularly, if you know, you know, and if you don't know, this is going to mean nothing to you, I'm afraid. So I feel like framing these as sort of in-jokes is useful, and in a way more like it's less hierarchical. It's coded language, but it's, we don't have to talk about why one is more significant than another. So I feel like, not understanding. And then the other thing you talked about that I have thought about as well is this like strange mixture of distance and closeness, like a feeling like on some level quite close. Like sometimes the voices that you encounter are, like you say, very intimate, and sometimes they're clearly in pain, or there's strong affect, or there's humor, or there's whatever. There's a range of emotional tonalities, but there's this strange, and I think this is probably particular to the internet, not the sense of emotional proximity and physical distance, which of course you could have from a book, but the temporal collapse. That also sometimes that you could be reading something written 5 minutes ago that you feel in some ways very close to, but you have no idea, or the person could be on the other side of the world or whatever. So there's a particular collapsing of time, which I feel like is particular to the internet, perhaps. And for regarding it as poetry, I mean, I think for someone who's interested in language, like seeing this innovative use of language is automatically exciting. If you're someone who's interested in poetry, I think, or for a lot of people who are, and I think it's we're now like firmly in an era where all of the linguistic innovation is happening textually, or most of it, or at least a large proportion of it, rather than in speech. And like, I feel like this used to be the domain, I mean, it still is to an extent, the domain of oral culture. But there's a separate or linked culture, which is textual innovation, which is now something basically every person under a certain age participates in and knows about. So I feel like it's become the concern of poetry in a way, from my eyes, when it enters a completely textual innovation sense. That's just more the tradition of poetry I'm familiar with. So yeah, and then I suppose there's the question of reframing, and that for me, there's certainly something that happens when you take language you found and you may have repurposed, you may have manipulated somehow, even if that's just putting line breaks in. But you're suddenly asking it to be considered. You're inviting the gaze that you turned on the language initially, which is like to find the excitement and innovation in that language, sometimes accidentally. But you're asking that to be passed on to a viewer in a way. You're asking that they bring an aesthetic sensibility to the work, to what you're looking at. I think there are quite interesting ethical questions about this, or ideas around appropriation, which I think are intriguing. And also, I mean, I suppose I would sort of go somewhere along this line of saying some engagement with this is a sort of registering of it in the work. But yeah, that's an interesting side of this as well.
Yeah, I think that, gosh, so many things there. One of which is the relish that both I find in both of your work for the particular idioms of the internet. So in Kim Kardashian's marriage, I mean, there are sort of things in there that I mean, I back in 2011, 2012. I mean, I didn't know what contouring was. So the language of a makeup regimen, which is kind of how the collection is structured, was kind of new to me and sort of strange and chewy and odd, and things like infinity pools, and there was a whole kind of lexis that I just didn't really know, and also a way of talking. But it was it was just very engaging, just looking at language being kind of molded and shaped in different ways, being held up to the light, and there's something about that's just, I think, to poets perhaps particularly endlessly kind of fascinating just on its own terms. I mean, likewise with Singlish and those interesting kind of phoneticisms in some of the threads that you use, Guang, where you get this kind of a whole new language, and that in itself is sort of fascinating aesthetically. I want to go back to the idea of play, perhaps before the ethical question, which is about humour, because there are definitely moments of laugh. I mean, I find myself laughing, and we spoke about this a little bit, Guang, sometimes, you know, that it makes you laugh. And then I was kind of analysing that humour, that laughter, and thinking, what is that? Is that a kind of patronising, look at these hilarious people? What was the humour about? I felt I had to examine that, or whether it was just a kind of relish in the inventiveness of language. And both of you I think you have a particular kind of, what can we call it, lyric hygiene, I suppose, where there isn't a lyric I in there. That's kind of not part of the procedural approach. So you are kind of throwing those questions on the reader. And I wonder if if you had any thoughts about that, the sort of humour, enjoyment, at the other end of which would, I suppose, be a kind of satire of the sort that's explored quite thoroughly in Dead Souls, for example. Any thoughts about either of those things?
Yeah, maybe what I'll say is these people on these forums are having a lot of fun themselves. I don't think all of them, I mean, they're definitely not fully representing who they are on these forums. They're putting on a persona. They're playing with language. They are sometimes very clearly people who are, putting on their speech patterns that they would not otherwise do in real life. And they're just having fun with these personas. And I think that is sort of like, it reflects in some of these pieces. But also there is an aspect of people who are not as self-aware and who are just sort of, speaking or like typing, they're drunk or something, and they have like misspellings in their typing. And to me also that is sort of like you didn't know it, but you are, having fun with language, and to me that's also quite humorous as well. And I suppose that the last thing I'll say is that which touches on the sort of ethical questions a little bit, that a lot of in these spaces are sort of free expressive spaces where people say whatever they want, right? And inevitably that leads to them making things like sexist, racist, like whatever is sort of like statements or jokes, and that has been sort of at least for them, that generates a lot of the humor of these forums as well, that they feel like they are free to say whatever they want. Yeah, but how I've dealt with it, I guess I'll leave it to another question I'll later.
The question about humor. I think for me there's sometimes with found text particularly, when the reader, it's telegraphed to the reader somehow that the I in the poem is not coterminous with the person on the front of the book, or if there is overlap, that's part of the game or something. But the language is being sort of built out of material rather than generated from some interior space. And so the kind of voices that emerge from that are amalgamations. And I think there's one extreme would be like I'm making a sort of caricature. Like this is something I've actively tried to avoid, I suppose. But like this would be one possible criticism of this sort of work, is that you make a sort of a straw man or a kind of a puppet, which it's implied that you're mocking. It's implied that you're finding the contortions of this language puppet you've made are amusing, and it sort of lacks this self-awareness that Hao Guang was talking about. It doesn't really reflect back on its own linguistic character or something. Like that would be one extreme, and that might include a notional character or speaker who, for example, says unacceptably racist or sexist things, and that we would then be kind of holding up this construct as a kind of example of something, maybe, to point at it. And then there would be another extreme, which would be like I'm speaking through the mask, like that I'm making this character through which I can say what I really think or something. Like, in a way, like having borrowed the language is a disclaimer, and it allows me to opt out of really meaning it. But that's the paradox of why I can actually say these things, right? So I feel like that those are two like and weirdly enough, the work might look the same, but you could have either of those takes on the work. And I think that for me, the sort of the delicacy of this kind of work is to avoid either of those things exactly. Like I don't want the disambiguation of either of those interpretations. There's certainly moments in the poems where I feel like I could literally not have said that any more clearly, and it's basically my sentiment to some degree. That might be about some particular predicament in the poem that the poem's brought up, and then there might be situations where it's like, well, I probably wouldn't say that, but I'm getting a speaker to say that with knowing that it has some distance from me. Nonetheless, I'm not naive enough that I know I'm not participating in this language structure, that I'm not licensing it or something, right? There's obviously some territory into which I'm not going to go, because what would be the point? What the poet would lose there is it would harden into a definite. It would lose its ambiguity, and it would become a definite like mechanism or something. So I feel like creating this sort of chamber where for me, this is to do with like forcing a reader or like inviting maybe a reader into into thinking about this quality of language, right? That it doesn't seem to be exactly fixed around a particular person sometimes. That we're in the vicinity of it, but we're not exactly occupying it. And this seems to me like a condition of language generally. And I think putting the reader into that position, like asking these questions about who's saying what and how close are they to what they're saying and what's our perspective on that, is to sort of start to think a bit more critically or concertedly about how vocalizing or writing relates to the individual or the community or whatever.
Yeah, I just before you come in there, Guang, it's just interesting, isn't it? Well, I've always felt that the question around what what the relationship between a poem and the poet is it's a kind of, it can become a rabbit hole very quickly, as though you were talking about a condition of language that didn't permeate all of our lives all the time and everything we say anyway, and the sort of questions of authenticity and speaking can become quite I don't know, in a way unproductive sometimes. But I think that I was struck there by, as I understand it, a difference in your two modes of composition, where if we're talking about Kim Kardashian's marriage as an example, where you, Sam, you decided in advance that you were going to take text from a certain set of constraints and that there wouldn't be much choice at that stage of selection. Whereas Guang, I think, as I understand it, you said you described trawling through forums and selecting. So I'm wondering if there were things that you looked at and thought, oh no, I'm not going to have that. I'll put that fish back and I'll take this one instead. And if there were kind of limits, and how that perhaps bears on the ethics question that you started to answer earlier.
Yeah, I should. So I'm going to go into gory detail a bit, because I think it's important. There are two different forums that I've been looking at. So there's the Malaysian one called laoyat.net, and there's a Singapore one called EDMW, or Eat, Drink, Man, Woman. And they have different, they function in slightly different ways technically, and that has shaped the way that I look through them. So the Malaysian one has its archives. It's not as well sort of populated, so it's easy to go right to the first ever post that I can find on the archive, and then sort of work my way forwards in time and just scan all the threads that have ever been put up on this forum. So that was a lot of okay, let's click to the next thing, and whatever attracts my attention, I go for it. And then for the Singapore forum, there has been so much activity on it over the 15, 20 over years that it's been around, that you can't do that. And it's physically or digitally not possible to click to the very first post. And so instead, what I've had to do is to do keyword search. So I sort of think about what sort of thing I might want to write about, and then keyword search it, and then find what are the sort of results that pop up. Right, so actually very different ways of working. So I find that the Malaysian forum poems tend to be more random and even less of what I would be obsessed about inside, because I just stumble upon all these funny things. And then the Singapore poems tend to be sort of more directed. So there's one day I woke up and there's this thing called the haze in Singapore, where Indonesia does slash and burn agriculture, and smoke comes to Singapore. And so it was hazy that day. So I typed in, I was like, hey, surely people have complained about the haze on these forums before. So I typed in haze, and I came up with a haze poem. So that's sort of the I guess how I look for things, right? There's too many fish, so it's more about picking the fish and not about putting it back. Yeah, that being said, I think maybe I've told you before, Tiffany, that when I come across very serious, there are these controversies on the forums that sometimes do relate to for example, race. They're like, oh, all these Filipinos on this forums, why don't you have your own Filipino forum? Get out of our forum, sort of thing. I think it's actually something worth writing about. Or worth collaging. I haven't done it myself, but I feel like I must do it. These are the sort of things I must go for. And to me, I think the bar is sort of linguistic. Like if the language itself is sort of interesting to me, that's where I'll go. And I think it's clear. It's clear from the reading that like the writer does not represent the views. In fact, there are many views and they contradict each other within a poem. So I think that sort of makes it clear enough that the poem itself is not particularly for or against any point of view.
And also, you don't want to sanitize your content in a way as well. Like, surely, I mean, maybe that's kind of, I didn't necessarily mean the ethics of, although that's possibly a question of like appropriating specific people or something, but like this idea of representing everything or something, that like if you're, and like being aware that there's a hierarchy of information or something that you're if you're using any kind of search process, you're engaging with like some information is good. Or for me with the Kardashian book, because I was using Google, the type of information that reaches me is not random. It's whatever's been, selected by Google to be more relevant to that search term. So it's not as if I'm just dipping my hand into the ocean and coming up with something. It's been prearranged, this stuff. So it's inevitably going to be somewhat of a reflection of that process. But then I think that means that there's some obligation to be just faithful to the process somewhere, which might mean representing different facets of the materials you find, right? And if there's enough dissonance between those fragments, and it's like, but it's like that you have to sort of maybe consider the idea that if you're dealing with found text, there's an element of documentary, if you like. There's an element of like needing to represent, or that you might be unwittingly representing something, so that like some consideration of like showing enough of the totality. It's impossible to show everything, but unless you were going for a really particular, I suppose that's the thing, is there's enough potential like strategies about this where you could be just going after certain things, and then that would be your approach, right? There's a book by Robert Fitterman called No Wait, Yep, I Definitely Still Hate Myself, which is all about depression and sadness, and these are all culled from blogs. But he's going after like one emotional strain, I suppose, and then whatever comes out of that, he'll use. You inevitably need a limit of some description. Yeah, definitely that some of this questions I remember occurred to me about like if I'm just rejecting stuff that I find distasteful or whatever, does that mean that I'm sort of considering the process is sort of part of the work? It's like present in the work. Does that mean that I'm misrepresenting my process or the process I'm using if I'm like sort of then cherry picking because if I'm like, well, I don't really like that bit. Or even just the idea of the sort of quality of the language. Like sometimes there would be something where I was like, a couple of the poems in the Kardashian book are just like 2 lines on because I just really couldn't find much to work with. So I was just like, well, that's going to have to do for that one. I can't really get anywhere with this. There just wasn't anything. There wasn't enough there. So I had to sort of go down to like minimalism at that point. I don't know. I'm free associating slightly.
Yeah, I think that's really a relevant point because it is about artfulness, isn't it? And it is about exercising some choice in the interests of the aesthetic effect of the whole. Otherwise, it would just be an experiment. It would be something like Tristan Tzara's, poem, Dadaist poem, where you you take words out of a bag and you cut up an article. I suppose you would choose the article in the first place. So there is always, I think, the idea of a kind of a core sample that's completely neutral.
Yeah, exactly. Just being aware of the frame that you're setting something at the beginning, right? Whether that's the particular forum you're using or the particular search term, but that should be like acknowledged as like part of the architecture somehow. I guess it feels like that's as much part of the work as like the more granular cut and pasting or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, on that subject, I'm thinking about the architecture of collections as opposed to isolated poems, or if Sam, how you've thought, because each of those three, the 3 Faber collections, they do seem to have their own kind of conceptual architecture that works at the level of collection, perhaps more than individual poems. I'm just wondering, don't even know what the question is here really, but is it the case that this sort of conceptually driven work like this, it needs to occur at scale, that it might be more helpful to think at the level of an extended experiment rather than an isolated poem?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure why that is. I think I'm the other side of this for me is positioning this kind of material in a book. To me, it's like sometimes you can do something with found text and just like transpose it over into print or into the context of a poem, say, or a poetry pamphlet, and nothing really happens. It's just still obviously what it is. Other times you do that and it's like it activates it somehow, and there's another, because you're demanding a different sort of reading and a different sort of attention. It's like some other dimension of the text becomes visible, or like it becomes a 3D sort of thing, or it becomes something with other capacities. And I think that's kind of what I'm looking for when I'm doing this kind of writing. And I think also I'm just someone who, for me, the book is a very interesting formal device, like as a capacious and sort of multi-dimensional, it moves through time. It has a sort of, its parts have relationships to each other. It can be mapped. It's, I think that's something that, for me, is kind of very related to why I write at all, like the intricacy and scale of a book. So, like, I definitely, perhaps it's one of these things that becomes, it gets its wings and claws, or whatever Nabokov says about a novel. That it gets its sort of scale and sense of artistry and its sort of artistic trajectory or something when it achieves a certain level of complexity, and before that it's almost a bit too obvious what it is. So I feel like I needed to get certain multiple things moving in the book, multiple things to be present in the books that they could then talk to each other, they could then interact in different ways. So I think that's something I did in 81 Austerities. Thematically, I structured the book basically according to theme, rotating themes, and then in the Kardashian book it was more like the titles became the indicators of how things would move around. So because one of the words is heaven, there's quite a lot of biblical language in there. Because one of the words is grave, there's quite a lot of death. And then there's just various other, one of the words is girlfriend, so there's quite a lot of like romantic, cute stuff in there. So like it's like you get these sort of things that start to interact with each other on different levels, and you start to build something, or something starts to sort of build, which it feels like has range and a sort of open-ended structure in a sense. And I feel like with one, unless the poem, of course it could just be a long poem, but for me to sort of do a one-page found text poem, it's going to be very much probably a reflection on the text that it's sourced from, or a particular recontextualizing move that is like a kind of a gag in a way. I mean, I really like poems like that, but it feels like what I was trying to do was something a little bit more ambivalent than that, and it required more. It required a sense of like something being a little bit like formally not quite definable. Like although the books are very formally structured, like I always feel like with a book there's a sense that you can't quite see the form. Like the form is sort of like unwieldy and it slightly exceeds your visualization. Yeah.
Yeah, that I wondered how Guang, if that question of sort of scale, accumulation, because you're at an earlier stage of something now, so I suppose I'm wondering if sort of this chimes with your present process in any way, useful or maybe otherwise.
Yeah, I don't. So whether this thing is a book or what sort of book it is, I think has changed over time. It started out with me just thinking, okay, like I don't think there's enough in here for a whole book, and so maybe it's a pamphlet. But then the more I looked into it, the more I felt a lot of stuff coming out, right? And so I thought maybe this is enough for a book. But I haven't actually thought about how to section things. Like when I sent both of you that email with like the attachment with the poems in it, that was the first time I had actually sort of like thought about how I should, which poem should come first and that sort of thing. And so I'm still in the process of thinking about these things. But Sam, I think what you said about the book as a very interesting form, I agree with that a lot. And I think I need to find that key or whatever it is, like find that principle by which I can organize this thing before it can become a book.
I really like the element of indexing that came in towards the end, like the sent from piece. And there were various ones which is almost like they started to feel like they were, indexing like certain elements of the messages. And I thought that, to me, is quite compelling because it starts to become a bit like, you look at the contents or index of a book and there's this sense of like the potential mass of the book, but you're seeing it in a very abbreviated form. But I felt like that really pointed at the sort of strange multiple like location and speaker quality of the source material in a really like playful and kind of enlivening way. Like I like just seeing all the different names of the devices people were using. Like it's kind of interesting, and also it does interesting things with time and it seemed like a very like quite beautiful in a way to think of all of these people in different places on different devices, all sort of meeting in this strange space, like quite peculiar.
Yeah, exactly. I love that. And I think I've also told Tiffany before that I find a sort of maybe perverse delight in considering that these like forum posts that Singaporeans often look down on it and say these are all like sort of low culture, not worth talking about, then sort of hopefully in the future appear in print and are called poetry. I think that to me is very fun. Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like poetry has often had to do this, right? Like update or something, or just take like, that throughout the history of poetry, it's been a series of people taking notice of the language of the time and what is happening to it, and like finding some way to record that in the writing. That might not be sometimes completely literal, and it might sometimes be, concept driven or imaginative or something, but I think it always travels over. And I think part of the enjoyment of doing this sort of, is the provocation slightly, or of forcing people to read as poetry stuff that you just typically wouldn't think was poetry. And I feel like that's always something I've enjoyed when I found poetry that does that, where I've been like, oh, I never thought you could do that in a poem. And then you're like, oh, someone's done it. And it's always like like an eye-opening moment or something, or like it renews your, I don't know, for me, it renews my appreciation of like what it can do. It can shift things around you in a way, which is surely part of it.
There's something in both of your work that I've been reflecting on that I mean, it is to do with feeling kind of it's responding to the intimacy and feeling kind of touched by it, and different devices being registered, as you said, Sam, or something that's kind of time stamped. And I'm thinking of one of your publications, Sam. I think it's Amy Key's. It's a list of Uber correspondences, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's kind of like time. And it is, as far as I can tell, it is literally found text, but it's something about the way it stands for a particular moment that now is in kind of conventional mainstream lyric poetry, if I can use a really baggy catch-all term, or never really feels very fresh and engaging anymore. But somehow that digital marker is poignant. It has a poignancy that it really affects me in both of your work in different ways. And I'm not quite sure what my point is here, except that it's something to do with the fact that in order to have that kind of affective liveness, poetry probably needs to be able to encompass the current modes of expression in their most intimate and immediate and sometimes least self-conscious forms. The fact that they're then framed in a more self-conscious way and sort of angled to the light in a different way is part of the artfulness, perhaps. But there is, what am I trying to get at? That there's I get real feeling.
Yeah,
from
I think also
work.
because, yeah, no, thank you for saying that about that pamphlet by Amy Key, which I think was one of the first ones that I did, where I was like, something had transformed, the text had somehow transformed, but it was just a list of her Uber pickups. But when you present it as, on some level, it sounds a bit pretentious, but also like something does happen when you just read a whole string of them. They're all the same person being rescued or taken away from certain situations, and like by different people in different vehicles at different times. But it's like the same thing. It's like a series of departures or something. It just seemed to me that like they're suddenly opened up. There's a lot of interpretations. And also there's something about the fact that so much of our activity is documented in text now. And that text has a kind of situating truth value, for want of a better expression. Like it has a kind of pinpointing effect that we kind of abide by in life. You know, we're very used to seeing these textual cues that position us very clearly. And in fact, they do have an emotional or affective latency of some description too. And that they can hem us in, or they can ask us to do, they can instruct us, they can, you know, direct us, they can coerce us, all sorts of things. So I feel like registering that this language is, okay, it might seem on some level quite depersonalized, but it's experienced. Language is always experienced in the mind of the person. Like that's its sight. So like whether in Amy's thing we might think about like the person themselves who's in that scenario, or the person who receives that message, right, and is receiving a kind of like an out or a departure from a setting. It feels like the language is always attached to a person, however depersonalized it might seem, right? And then there's the driver on the other side of it too. Like, I just felt like it's to me, it seems as if an early critique of sort of conceptual based or found writing is that it sort of gets rid of the subjective experience. But to me, I think it started to feel like the more I've looked into it, the more I feel like it can actually allow us to access something of the subjective experience, which is otherwise quite elusive and otherwise quite easy to overlook. So I feel like that's been the idea. I hope is that one discovers this by doing this work or by reading it, you know, that you sort of, you actually find out something or a couple of things about that. But I certainly found that in reading Hal Guang's manuscript as well, like the sense of this, the intense sociality of it is something that I hadn't really encountered before. The voices are kind of all the same voice, but they're also they're a society, really. You know, it's a whole community of people, and it makes you think how language is so it has to be socially experienced, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't change.
Yes. Do you want to respond to that, Halgor? We just take the compliment.
Yeah, I mean, well,
do a bit of mutual admiration.
Thank you for that, Sam. So my sort of one revelation came about when I first published some of these poems in the book. It's an anthology called The Second Link, and it collects the Malaysian forums. It's sort of meant to be a Singapore Malaysia sort of thing, and then I had to read these poems out loud for the first time, and I was struggling because these are many voices, sometimes saying contradictory things, as I said, and then I had to signpost like when these voices changed. And I'm not really an actor or anything, so I can't like do it as well as, you know, some people can do that. And so I've ended up having to sort of figure out ways, strategies to perform these poems that foreground this sociality. Yeah, it's basically I end up having to embody like a community of people. So to me, I'm just reflecting on this, it's kind of mind-blowing, and I don't think I'm any good at it yet, but I feel like the more I get into it, the more I'm imbibing this community. And at some point, for example, I will have to pick up like Thai in order to read one of the poems that I've written. That sort of thing.
Do you feel like you've internalized any elements of it as well? Like that, like having used this kind of language and obviously spent quite a lot of time with it. Do you think it's worked its way into your normal writing voice at all in any way? Or do you feel that they're very separate?
I think it has made some of its way into my texting voice. Like when I text friends or people, it has come out quite a fair bit. And I'm not sure if it will come out in like poetry that I write, because I'm not actually writing anything except for these like form poems so far. But we'll see. I'm sure something will come through. Like,
I think sometimes even just syntactical structure or something. There are a couple of things I remember doing through collage where I was like, I would never write that, but I need to join these things together, and that's how I'm going to do it. And then later on, I would find myself thinking of that sentence structure again and finding it was now like part of my equipment or something. Kind of weird.
Yeah, exactly. That's a social aspect of language, right? Where you just sort of pick up things and yeah.
Yeah, I love that idea actually of it becoming something that you then sort of circulate in your own everyday linguistic use. I mean, that's what should be happening. Sort of plasticity of these forms, and I do love the ingenuity of digital language, and even in its vintage forms, like when you used to text using you as a you and things like that. I love that, and I think there's something really exciting about it. I know it's kind of I don't think we're meant to think that, but nonetheless, I do. I'm conscious that we've almost come to the end of the time, which is a real shame, because I feel like in some ways we're just getting going. And I do hope that Meet the World will have links to your respective work, because I'm sure that anyone who's heard you talking will want to read more of your work. It would be lovely to hear some to conclude. So I wonder if perhaps Sam and then Guang, you could both read something. Yeah, thank you. Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tiffany. I'll just read a poem again from the same manuscript. I was trying to find one that might vaguely relate to what we've been talking about. This is called Dead PDF. No more to my name than a small poem written on the margins of a newspaper. There should be nothing for them to believe except in dreams. For now these strange notes are only known to my sister. I'll try to recall the story of the cat who got inside the cellar one summer. A woman was having trouble sleeping in a neighbouring house and tried to sneak down to see what the noise was. She entered through one of the windows and had an encounter with a strange being. He called to her with those eyes of his, as strange as any face that she had ever seen. She saw him looking with fear into a cellar window above her head, and she heard him ask her something. In the afternoon, his body seemed to disappear into the house, as if one hand were pulling at him while another were lifting his chin. The cellar door had been closed tightly. The night had been warm and silent and dark. In the cellar windows, light had not flashed. It would soon take him too. The next morning the body vanished, and no trace of any human voice was found.
I'll read a poem called Fist of Dragon. This is a Malaysian forum poem. Fist of Dragon. Singapore movie, Kiss of Dragon, Fist of Dragon, Limb of Dragon, blah blah blah. Singapore is a good feng shui land. Might be better than KL Drift 2. What the hell, Singapore, where got gangster one guy? All nerd. Yeah, Jack New always find nerd gangster, even I one person dare to whack out all of them. Actually, is it possible one day we get back our Singapore? It actually belongs to us, cause I very dislike Tunku Abdul Rahman just let Singapore to go away, and you see now Singapore damn rich. Can we say last time that contract was fake or not, sir? I find this is loser thinking. I thought all Kung Fu schools in Singapore closed down after Silat Masa owned all of them. Last month I took plane to Singapore. Not bad, the airport lols, and the city very well planned, very civilized. Can we get it back? Please don't be dumb, love. I won't read your poster. I got plan on how to take over Singapore, but cannot post. Afraid Singaporean luck here. Singapore speak English right shit one. Singapore invented Hainanese. The Hainan chicken rice is Hainaner than the Hainan people in Hainan. Enter the dragon, wata!
Oh, it's wonderful. You found a way of doing it. I love that. It's like you've kind of taken off the mask, put on a new one, and come back up with a new voice on. That's brilliant. That's
how I've had to deal with it. Yeah,
it's fabulous. Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you both so much. I feel really lucky to have been able to hear you talking together and to each other and to me. So thank you very much, Sam Riviere and Guang. And thank you for helping us meet the world. I've been glad to meet your world.
Thank you so much, Tiffany and Sam.
Thank you, Guang. Thank you.